Hello and welcome. I'm Professor Lukas, and today we'll be talking about thesis statements. This information is adapted from Chapter 2, The Writing Process, in my textbook, College Composition and Reading, Information and Strategies. An important part of both the writing process and the finished product is the thesis statement, which is the focus for the entire piece of writing. The thesis statement includes both the topic or subject being discussed, as well as the argument or perspective being advanced about it. In other words, the thesis statement is both what you are talking about and why you are talking about it. In some ways, it's like a topic sentence for the entire essay. Often, a thesis statement will also include a list of reasons, which will help to persuade the reader, as well as setting up the organization for the following. For example, you might have the idea to write an essay about vaccines. That's a great topic, as there's a lot of controversy surrounding them. However, that is only a topic. For a full thesis, you'll need not only your topic, but also the argument you're making about it. Whether you are arguing for or against makes a big difference to your essay. In addition, you might add a reason to support your thesis. Ironically, both those for and against vaccines usually use illness as their primary support. There are several compelling reasons to have a clearly and directly stated thesis. One is that it forces you to test your ideas by distilling them down into a clear focus for the entire essay. In turn, this will help you to have better organization and development, as having a written-out thesis to refer to can make it easier to stick to the point and connect back to it regularly. Finally, having a clear thesis will be helpful to your readers, letting them know what you'll be arguing, and thus how to interpret the explanations and information that you include. There are several types of thesis statement. Thesis statement of fact concern matters that, in theory, can be verified independently. All that is needed is access to the information. Claims of value or judgment represent an appraisal or an evaluation and can be absolute, like the city council is doing a poor job, or in relation to something else, like the city council is doing a worse job than the one in the neighboring city. Finally, claims of policy involve action and the future. What should be done? We'll discuss these types of arguments or thesis statements further in the chapter on argumentation. However, knowing the types can work as both a test and an idea generator. If you have a thesis statement, you can ask yourself which type it is to see whether you've really made a thesis or if you've accidentally written down a fact which merely implies the argument to be made. In addition, thesis statements should have several qualities. Generally, it should be a single sentence, given either at the beginning or the end of your introduction. You want it to be in a place where it's emphasized, which is why you want to start or end with it. And if you don't end with the thesis, you should end the introduction by connecting back to it or restating it, making it impossible for readers to miss the point you're going to support. Having the thesis at the end is the most common pattern, as it allows you to start by talking generally, giving an example, or doing something else that gets the reader's attention and leads smoothly to your more specific argument. The thesis statement should also be arguable. There should be some element of controversy to it, in that there is no reason to discuss something that everyone already agrees on. You also want to make sure that your thesis statement is specific enough. In general, you want to be as focused and specific as your subject and the length will allow. You want to make sure that it's manageable, not too broad to cover fully in the space available, or too narrow to say much of anything about. In addition, you want to use strong, confident language so that your reader sees that you're convinced, and that helps them be persuaded as well. If you don't feel strong and confident, pretend. Your thesis should also be subject to revision if you change your mind or end up writing an essay that supports some slightly different topic or argument than your originally stated thesis. Don't be afraid to change a thesis to match your essay. Finally, the thesis should guide the development of your entire paper. It's the focus of the essay. It's the focus of that piece of writing, and therefore it should be your focus as you build that piece of writing. You should also avoid saying things like, "I will discuss," or "this paper will be about." Simply state what the paper's about. There's no need to mention yourself when you are presenting your ideas. In fact, you should only mention yourself when it's relevant, when you're using your own experiences as an example or support. You also want to avoid stating a fact that implies the argument but doesn't state it outright, particularly since your readers might come up with a different interpretation than you do. For example, if you state that there are over 100,000 children in America waiting to be adopted, is that an argument that people should adopt? That abortion restrictions should be lifted? That more money needs to be provided to the system? Or some other argument? The reader has to guess, because you did not tell them. Another related issue is when the thesis statement is missing entirely. The facts are given, but the reader is supposed to guess what the argument is, which is problematic for several reasons, not the least of which is that they might guess wrong. Finally, the last common issue with thesis statements is when they are buried or hidden. You want your reader to know what your thesis is without having to put in any effort at all. You want it so obvious that the reader has to work to not know what your point is. Whatever people read last sticks with them more than something they read in the middle of a longer paragraph. Therefore, you want your thesis to either be the last sentence in your introduction, or else reiterated in the last sentence if you have it at the beginning. You want readers to leave your introduction with a reminder of the point they were supposed to get from the paper. Let's take a look at some example thesis statements to give you some concrete illustrations in how to apply these rules. Here are several problematic thesis statements. I invite you to take a moment to pause the lecture and look at the thesis statements to see if you can spot their problems. The first thesis reads, "Half of school kids today are not receiving proper nutrition." However moving that might be, it is a fact, not a thesis. Once you have proven that the fact was true, there's nowhere else to go. This implies that something should be done about it, but doesn't actually say that. A fixed version of this thesis would take care of this problem, including the fact only as support for the argument about what should be done. Since half of school kids today are not receiving proper nutrition, school lunches need to have their quality improved. The second thesis, "My paper will be about nuclear power," has two major problems. The first is that it mentions the paper itself. You shouldn't ever mention the paper. Keep your focus on the topic. The second is that while it does give the topic, nuclear power, there's no indication of what argument is being made about that topic. A fixed version might say something like, "Nuclear power should be used more widely," which states what change needs to be made, as well as focusing on the argument at hand rather than the paper itself. The third thesis, that high school starts too early, comes off sounding like a complaint rather than a thesis, and really only implies what the person is actually trying to argue, which is that high schools should begin later in the day. Giving a reason can also strengthen the stated thesis. Finally, the fourth example says, "I think that drowsy driving is worse than drunk driving." Well, it's nice you feel that way, but there's no need to write an entire essay to convince me. I believe you think that just based on you saying you think that. However, the point of the essay is not about your feelings or to prove that something is your opinion. The point is to show that your argument is actually true. The fact that it is your opinion is unimportant. Also, a thesis should usually be about what should or should not be done. So a corrected version might read, "People need to be educated about the dangers of drowsy driving, which is more dangerous than drunk driving." Hopefully these examples have helped you see how to avoid some of the most common types of errors while keeping your thesis focused and appropriate. Now we're ready to move on to our final topic, outlines. I hope that this has been helpful for you in better understanding how to form and evaluate thesis statements. However, for now, we're ready to move on to the final topic for this chapter, outline.